Welcome back to the Definite Article. I'm Emily Carver. I'm the Media Manager at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today, I'm joined by the IEA's Director General, Mark Littlewood, and also Julian Jessup, who is an economics fellow here. We're going to be discussing Mark's latest column out in the Times today, entitled "Fighting Over Post-Pandemic Tax Rises is the Start of a Longer-Term Economic War." You can find the link below in the description box. It's behind a paywall, but you can still read part of it. So, should tax rates be hiked to pay for the government's monumental spending during the pandemic, or would an increased tax burden stifle any meaningful economic recovery? That's the topic of today's discussion, and we're going to be hearing from both Mark Littlewood and Julian Jessup. If you enjoy this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And why not leave a comment letting us know what you think on the subject. So, Mark, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Emily. Good evening.
Good evening. I thought I'd start with you. So we're in a nation, our nation has over £2 trillion of debt at the moment. In your article, you identify a new divide that's been emerging in the debate around how we can tackle the dire state of our public finances. What are these competing visions that you set out in your article?
Yeah, so I was remembering back to about 10 years ago, Emily, and obviously no two scenarios are identical. In fact, in fiscal terms and in health terms, this crisis is far worse than the backwash of the banking crisis. But if you were to go back to 2010, there are some similarities. There was a new government in power, a Conservative Liberal coalition. The state of the public finances was bleak. A colossal deficit had been run up, and the economy had gone backwards quite measurably, probably by about 6 or 7%. Julian might know the exact numbers as a result of the banking crisis. And here was the argument. The argument was, do we need to solve this deficit problem and fast? Or is this a sort of one-off hit and sooner or later the banks will return to health and there's absolutely no way we can countenance a public sector pay freeze or a reduction in this department's spending or that department's spending? And to some degree, at least in the narrative, the hawks won that battle. The coalition committed themselves to a programme of so-called austerity. Their initial plan was to balance the budget by 2015. That turned out to be a bit of a pipe dream. In fact, we still hadn't balanced it by the time of the pandemic. And it's deja vu all over again in a way, because what we're seeing as a result of the pandemic is another one-off hit. I don't know whether these black swan events happen, once a decade or once every 12 years, another one-off hit. And some people, if you like, the people that a good number of us at the IEA would have agreed with 10 years ago are sort of saying, well, the public finances are in a disastrous state. That maybe we need to look at some spending we can cut, but there's probably going to be even more spending running out of the door, because let's assume unemployment goes up, welfare spending will go up. If there's a recession, tax receipts will go down. So something must be done, and we're going to have some tax hikes to plug this gap. Interestingly, a good number of people who were hawkish 10 years ago, however, are saying the last thing we need right now, it would be catastrophic for the economy, is a hike in taxes. In fact, what we need to see is a swift economic recovery. Let's bounce back and undo the damage caused by the pandemic and the lockdown. And to do that, let's keep, all sort of taxes relatively low. Or I think the suggestion we're going to reduce anything is probably a pipe dream, but let's not whack up the top rate of income tax or reverse all of the corporation tax cuts. Let's just wear this deficit. Let's live with it. Even though I think it will be the largest deficit in British history. And as you say, Emily, our overall cash national debt is now more than 100% of GDP. So I think this is, now, I'm not sure who the hawks are going to be, because nobody's come out really and on the front foot in public and has said, look, your taxes have got to go up because we've got these eat out to help out schemes, we've got these furlough schemes, we've got these business loans, someone's got to pay for them. Some murmurs in the newspapers that that's where the Treasury thinking is, but it's difficult to identify the hawks. We know who the doves are. there are people like Graham Brady of the 1922 committee, David Davis and others who are saying, yeah, the deficit's a problem, but it's a one-off hit. Let's take, 5 years, 10 years, I'm putting words in their mouth on that, to pay it all back. Most important thing is that we don't hit an already beleaguered private sector, and we return to growth as soon as possible. And you know what? I'm betwixt and between. I can see both sides of that argument. I'm worried about the scale of the deficit. I'm worried that there's a temptation every time there's a crisis to say, well, that was just a one-off hit. And sooner or later, these one-off hits add to your long-term bank balance. And we're now, all of the slow, painstaking work that was done to try and get to a budget, a balanced budget, we didn't get there, but we were edging towards it, to try and keep national debt below this slightly magical figure of 80% of GDP. It's considered that beyond that, you're starting to enter dangerous waters. That's now appears to be for the birds, and I'm concerned about that. So obviously I want lower taxes, but a part of me says, if you're going to go and do crazy eat out to help out schemes and subsidise everybody's hamburgers, someone's got to pick up the bill. And I'm not sure it's fair to or rational to keep delaying that bill forevermore. So I think this is going to be the new battleground, and I don't know who's going to win.
Julian, thanks, Mark. Julian, do you share that analysis? I know that you've been quite positive about our economy and our prospects. You've been far more optimistic than some others at the IEA team, I think it's fair to say. Are you more laid back about the deficit, about the debt that we have? And do you share Mark's analysis of sort of being somewhere in between the two?
Well, at the moment, I think I'm probably best described as an ultra dove. I think the idea of raising taxes anytime soon is completely bonkers for three main reasons. I mean, one Mark touched on already, which is that the economic recovery, although I believe it's quite a strong one, is still far too weak to be talking about tightening fiscal policy now. The second point is that, when the Treasury is talking about a hole in the public finances left by COVID, nobody actually knows how big that hole is, or indeed whether there's going to be a hole at all. I've seen figures suggesting there might be a permanent hole of, say, between 20 and 30 billion pounds a year. But actually already this year, the budget deficit, although it's huge, is running at about 30 billion below the forecasts of the Office for Budget Responsibility. So, we might well undershoot the deficit forecast by 30 billion this year. On the basis of that, how can you be confident there's a permanent black hole of 20 to 30 billion going forward many years from now? And then the third reason is that, we can afford to wait. Obviously, interest rates are extremely low. Only costs about 1% for the government to borrow for 10 years. The average maturity of UK government debt is now about 15 years. So even if interest rates shot up tomorrow, it will be a while before we need to start paying significantly higher interest rates on the back of that. So I think we can afford to wait. So there's certainly no urgency to raise taxes now. Over the longer term, though, I do have two concerns. One, I think I would agree with Mark that this isn't just about the size of the deficit itself and how easy it is to finance. It's also about the big increase in the role of the state that this implies. So even if it is quite cheap for the government to borrow money and spend lots of it, it still means the government is intervening in the economy in all sorts of ways that I personally would feel uncomfortable about. And the second point is that, over the longer term, there are some additional big fiscal challenges to come, particularly the aging of the population. There's a sort of demographic time bomb ticking away in the background. And even if I'm relaxed about the short-term outlook for the public finances, there are these big longer-term challenges that we need to tackle. And I would hope we'd be more imaginative than just thinking the only way to tackle those is through raising taxes. I mean, there are things you can do on the spending side, things you can do in terms of boosting growth as well, that in principle might not cost any public money at all. So the presumption that any time you've got a deficit, the only way to close it is by raising taxes, I think is something we definitely need to continue to challenge.
So, this is to both of you, really. So if tax rises are the wrong thing to do, what does our speedy recovery rely on? If you had your way, what do we need in order to boost our economy, boost jobs, boost growth coming out of this crisis?
Well, I would say that economically, not politically, but economically, there's an awful lot of supply side reform that you can undertake, which from an economist's perspective is free, basically. You can repeal regulations at the stroke of a pen if you're minded to. Politicians will see that through a different lens. They will worry that they're being seen as reckless, or they'll get bad headlines, or if they repeal some particular rule about health and safety in one area that's colossally expensive and then an accident happens, they'll be to blame. But I'm not trying to look at this through a politician's lens. So you could decide, if you like, in economic terms, the easiest path, I think, is a massive program of deregulation and supply side reform. And if you were to look at the steps the government are making on, say, planning reform, that's a step in the right direction, but it's hardly a stride in the right direction. My understanding of Brexit was one of the key reasons put forward by supporters of Brexit to leave the European Union was there was a whole ton of expensive interfering red tape that was hampering growth and holding back productivity. I haven't yet heard from the government, I think, a single regulation that they intend to incinerate. So, I mean, I would do all of this anyway, irrespective, whatever prevailing tax rate or spending rate you gave me that I might argue with, the deregulating and actually making it easier for people to be productive rather than spending all of their time going around complying would be a step in the right direction. But my fear is there appears to be precious little appetite for that at government levels as well. So we're stuck in a real quandary here. And Julian's quite right that we don't know the scale of the hit brought about by coronavirus in fiscal balance sheet terms. It's speculation about how bad the recession will be, how many people will be rendered unemployed. We just don't know. So perhaps we take a step back and look at it. But I'm not particularly confident that once we have looked at it and all of that data's in, that our political classes are going to draw the right conclusions that actually we're basically spending more than we can afford in the good times and spending much more than we can afford in the bad times. And that is a route to disaster. Now, I don't want to sound too apocalyptic. I'm not suggesting that the United Kingdom is going to have a Greek-style crisis by the end of this year, but that's the path we're traveling down. We are spending money that we don't have. We have obligations to, future pensions obligations, health obligations and the like that we don't seem to be remotely interested in renegotiating or reconsidering. And if you want to live in a very, very highly regulated, high spend economy, I don't, but if you take that as the premise, then unfortunately you have to live in a very, very high tax economy. And sooner or later, politicians have got to realise that that is the trade-off and pick a goddamn lane.
Julian, why is deregulation so low down the priority list? Why isn't it something that politicians are thinking about? We have a Conservative government who supposedly have free market instincts. What do you think is going wrong there?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. So one is that governments like to be seen to be doing things. And one of the things they like to be seen to be doing is intervening and regulating and controlling things. And that's part of it. But also there are, of course, quite a few people that benefit from the regulations that are in place. So if, for example, you liberalize a sector, whatever that sector is, there are bound to be some losers. And, they tend to lose more than the winners do. Even if there are fewer of them. And as a result, they tend to have more lobbying power. So we see this over and over again. I think that the planning reform was a good example of this, interesting how lots of town planners were coming up against liberalising the planning laws. And a cynic might suggest that's partly because they would then have less to do. I think there's a broader point here as well, that a lot of the decisions that the government might have to make over the next few years may well prove to be difficult and unpopular. I think one particular problem that is fast coming up is what to do about the national minimum wage or the national living wage. At the moment, the government is planning some quite big increases in the national living wage over the next few years, and I think that will. That's quite a popular thing to be talking about. But a lot of people are already raising concerns about whether this is the right thing to do at a time when unemployment, might spike in the autumn, when young people in particular may find it harder to keep jobs or to get new ones. And I think there needs to be a serious debate about whether now is the right time to press ahead with that increase in national living wage. And before people scream, oh, well, of course, the the IEA would say that, wouldn't they? Actually, that point was made back in June by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. They suggested the government should consider at least temporarily pausing the increases in the national living wage. So I think above all, at the moment, the government needs to find ways to allow markets to work better. So rather than intervening more, I think the government should be stepping back. We do have a very flexible labour market. It's very good at creating new jobs to replace those that are lost. And unfortunately, some will inevitably be lost because they're not sustainable under the new world of social distancing and so on. The government needs to step back and let the market adjust, even if in the short term, that unfortunately means that there's going to be a painful bump in unemployment over the autumn.
It seems to me that this government is terrified of making any decisions that are unpopular, hence why they've been U-turning so much during this pandemic. The minimum wage, I guess the fear is that there'll be a backlash of some description, even if it's the best thing to do. So we'll see if the government has a strong vision at some point. I think we all want to see that. So, Mark, you often talk about our tax code, how ridiculously long it is, 17,000 pages, I think it was. If you had a post-it note or a small piece of paper, which taxes would you allow to be kept? Which ones would you get rid of?
Oh, blimey. Well, I mean, I incinerate a hell of a lot of them, but I'd start with the loopholes, right? I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that given the Napoleonic Wars are over, we can now abolish income tax and keep it abolished. I think the argument for simplification there is rather different to the argument about the total burden. Irrespective of whether you think the state should be collecting 20%, 25%, 40%, 80% in tax, there's a separate question about the most effective taxes to levy, and I think you want to keep that very simple, and you want to tax the bad and not the good. I'm actually more relaxed about property taxes than I am about income taxes, for example. I think probably we could shift the burden somewhat onto land rather than on productive work. So I'm open-minded on how we reform the code and simplify the code. And I say that's a separate question to the overall burden. I think people, whether they are enthusiasts for higher tax or like me, an enthusiast for lower tax, can agree that the actual tax regime is utterly ridiculous. I mean, it's chock full of loopholes. It's keeping a wholly useless industry of tax avoidance alive. You need an accountant in order to navigate your way through the tax code. Most of the loopholes benefit the wealthy, not the average Joe. That then leads to a falling in morale. Everybody thinks everybody's cheating the system, therefore it's more legitimate for them to cheat the system, and all of the rest of it. So if Rishi Sunak came out and said, quite irrespective of the pandemic or the tax burden, let's rewrite the tax code from start, I would give him a hearty round of applause. I mean, my worry remains though that there's, and I see somebody posted in the YouTube chat as well, there's always seems to be good reasons that now is not the time to tackle the problem. Interest rates are low, that's true. It is true. The cost of borrowing is low. But miraculously, arguments can always be found as to why we shouldn't worry about it too much at the time. I'm not saying this is true of Julian, but the vast array of voices telling us that we don't need to worry about borrowing because interest rates were low. How many of these people were saying we needed to urgently slash government spending when interest rates were relatively high? Not that many. Julian probably would have done. But there's a good number of people who are, I think it's too easy for people to find excuses or reasons why now's not the time, government expenditure needs to be kept high, and we never end up solving this problem. So I agree with Julian on the national living wage, that hits the buffers. The triple lock on the pension, the state pension, is completely ludicrous. I mean, that was actually a Conservative Party election manifesto promise, a completely reckless one. It might be exposed as being completely ridiculous because you could see the state pension go up, even the wage. Let's just presume an extreme example. It's not a prediction, but I made this in a previous newspaper article. Let's just imagine that inflation and growth are 2% per annum, for sake of argument. But let's imagine that wages this year fall 20%, to pick a big high number. But next year, wages bounce back, the 25% rise next year, which will get wage earners back up to where they were. Those are extreme numbers. It's just to illustrate a point. The state pension would go up 2% this year, because that's inflation, and 25% next year, because that's wage growth. I mean, this is a wholly reckless, idiotic policy that might look good on a political leaflet or appeals to a particular base of voters who are numerous and have a propensity to vote, but in economic terms is absolute madness. And if you keep making these continually ludicrous pledges for short-term political or electoral reasons, the economy ends up being dragged down. And my plea, if we were to talk about the politics of it, would actually be, I think the best thing that politicians can do is to still look at the longer run. So to worry a little bit less about doing something that's right but unpopular today, and think a bit more about whether they expect it rationally to yield dividends over a 3 or 4 year period. And if it were to reap dividends over a 3 or 4 year period, why would the government care about being unpopular now? They presumably care about being popular when the next election comes round. I mean, the electoral cycle always leads to odd decisions being made, but they seem to be more worried about tomorrow's headlines than the state of the economy in 3 or 4 years' time. So I'm not hugely optimistic we're going to get a rational outcome here.
Yeah, Julian, as Mark just said, and as he expressed in his article, the Treasury isn't always able to embrace dynamic economic modelling and look beyond the immediate revenue and expenditure and look towards a more long-term viewpoint. Do you think that therefore it's highly likely that they'll end up focusing on immediate fiscal prudence rather than longer-term economic growth?
Well, I'm not sure. And frankly, that in itself is worrying. You know, as a long-term Treasury watcher myself, I'm not sure what the longer-term plan is. And at the moment, you know, I'm not even sure what the fiscal rules are going to be over the next few years. So, you know, the broad guidelines for what we want to happen to the deficit and to the debt levels are pretty much up in the air at the moment. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because there's so much uncertainty at the moment about the economy. There should be a sort of relentless focus on growth and, you know, getting the level of GDP back to where it was before the pandemic struck. But there is that big uncertainty about what's going to happen over the longer term. I think in those circumstances, you know, the best thing that the Chancellor can do is first of all not to make anything worse. So I think Mark quite rightly talked about the importance of simplifying the tax system wherever the Chancellor can. At the very least, that means not adding new taxes into the mix. And, you know, I'm concerned about things like the online sales tax, for example, the proposal that's been floated of a sort of additional 2 to 3% tax on the revenues that companies make online. The economic justification for that is extremely flimsy. You know, particularly the idea that, you know, online is somehow taking sales away from the high street, when in fact many high street businesses now have an online presence. It's many of them, it's actually online that's keeping them afloat. So it seems a bit bonkers to try and stand in the way of change in that way. So certainly don't add any new taxes. In terms of tax simplification, I think a priority should be to make sure that, you know, income is taxed at a similar rate, regardless of how that's earned. And I think there is a case, unfortunately, for looking again at things like the lower national insurance contributions that self-employed people pay. That might be something that needs to be revisited. And there are probably some things you can do in terms of equalising the tax treatment of income from employment and from capital. But these are the changes that, as Mark says, we should be considering in any event. Don't think they should be driven by the desire to raise revenue in the short term, which anything would simply hamper the recovery.
Mark, what do we do about spending, overall spending? In your article, you talk about how we've been running, you know, state expenditure has been exceeding 38% for years, and that's when it becomes unsustainable for economic growth. So how can we get that down? It's an awkward conversation that politicians don't seem to like to have, going back to the sort of austerity language that's become pretty toxic politically and with the public. What areas of expenditure could the government reasonably cut?
Well, I could reasonably cut almost any area of expenditure, I think, actually. I mean, I wouldn't have any particular government department being sacrosanct. I mean, I think ring fencing particular areas whether they're relatively small areas like international development aid, or whether they're ring fenced because you triple lock the pension, or you make a commitment to, I don't know, increase the NHS budget in real terms every year. You have to accept there are trade-offs here. And I think that for those of us who are concerned about both, not necessarily the immediate fiscal position, but the long-term fiscal position of the country, or as I mentioned in my Times article today, this is one hell of a long-term prediction, but the OBR say on the present trajectory, in 50 years' time, we'll have a national debt that is, I think, 4 times GDP. That's the path we're headed down. And if you like, the pandemic and the lockdown and the furlough scheme and the Eat Out Help scheme and all of that sort of stuff, those are just minor accelerators down a path to fiscal ruin that we're already going. So I reference in today's article, and it's from an IEA report on tax and growth. I think what we've got to look at, if we're serious about growth and long-term fiscal sustainability, is roughly what level of state expenditure is compatible with high levels of growth. It's not going to be an exact science. You can't get to a number with 2 decimal points because economic growth depends on a vast number of other things. We've already mentioned the regulatory environment, but in broad terms, what would that be? And the evidence seems to suggest that's around 20%, that the state sector should be around 20%. If all you cared about was economic growth, nothing else, you don't care about, looking after the poor, devil take the hindmost, the only thing that matters to you is GDP growth, you go for 20%. If you care about welfare maximisation, it might be as high as 30%. If you actually want the government, almost for its own sake, to be as big as it can be, you just want government spending to be the maximum, but you've got a long-term view. You don't want the government to go bust, this year or next year. You want it to be, over the long term, as large as it can be. That would be a strange thing to want, in my opinion. But if you did want that, somewhere around 38%, 40% is probably the maximum long-term sustainable number. Yeah, you can go above that. If there's a pandemic, you can go above that. If there's a war, pick a year where you want to have a big splurge of spending, you can do that. But over the long term, it needs to be there. So we need to move the argument to somewhere between 20 and 38% of GDP is what the government should be spending, there or thereabouts, somewhere in that band. I'm open to alternative economic analyses that suggest it might be a bit lower or a bit higher, but it's in that band. And you would be nuts if you want to be outside of that band. Now, given that band, what are our priorities? Is it putting money into the pockets of pensioners? Or is it more spending on the National Health Service? Or is it reducing pupil-teacher ratios in classrooms? Or is it international aid? Or is it rebuilding our military capacity? Every pound is a trade-off pound. So I think we've got to have a more mature debate about what are the parameters. What's the maximum we can reasonably spend and the minimum? And then within that cake, and that cake, is expandable or shrinkable, but we're spending beyond, we're spending beyond the size of the maximum cake tin at the moment. Within that, what are our priorities? And that's where politics should come in. Some politicians will probably argue that education is more important than the NHS. Others will argue that defence is more important than both of them. Whatever. That's the purpose of debate. But the democratic political debate isn't really relevant at the moment because we're living in a fantasy world that these trade-offs don't exist. And over the medium to long term, they most emphatically do. So that we've got to reset the debate somehow. And obviously, think tanks like the IEA, we exist to attempt to do that.
Julian, I'll give you the last word because we're coming up to half an hour.
Sure.
Do you share that view? Is that the sort of idea that you have as well?
Yes, I agree with almost everything that Mark has said. One small area of disagreement is I'm actually a bit more relaxed, I think, than he is about the triple lock on the state pension. I absolutely agree that it needs to be revisited for the coming year because of the quirk that he identified, and there could be a risk of double-digit increase in average earnings next year, and it'll be clearly bizarre to reflect that in pensions as well. But over the longer term, the reality is that the state pension in the UK is pretty low by international standards. People do need a pension. Providing it through a government scheme is an alternative to doing it through the private sector. I feel reasonably relaxed about that. My bigger concern is instead on health and social care spending, and that's where the demographic factors are absolutely huge. And there does seem to be a presumption that the only way for people to provide for their health and social care in old age is through government spending and through higher tax and taxation to finance that. I think we need to be far more imaginative than that. We need to look at the best practice elsewhere in Europe, where there's much more private sector involvement in the financing of and the provision of both health and social care. I think that's a really big challenge, of course, for any politician to take on, given the sort of the way in which the NHS is venerated in this country. But I think that would be probably the top of my list to tackle is to recognise that health and social care can't be left entirely to the government. There's a much bigger role that the private sector can play there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question that I think we could have a whole nother video on soon. Thank you so much for joining me, Julian and Mark. Thanks for watching this latest episode of The Definite Article. If you enjoyed it, please do leave a comment, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more. We've got lots more coming up in the next few weeks, so do stay tuned. Thanks for watching.